The status of a Holocaust survivor's American dream is improbable based on the traumas they have endured and the asymmetrical focus of the assistance given to them. After the liberation, many of the survivors had been placed into displaced persons camps. These camps were meant to be holding places while refugees waited to be accepted into new countries or their own country figured out what to do with them. Many tried to leave their countries, but it was difficult because most countries were unwilling to change their old policies. Many survivors tried to go to different countries but were rejected upon arrival. Fortunately, the United States opened their immigration policy to allow more Jewish refugees to enter. 140,000 Holocaust survivors migrated to America. These immigrants weren't just coming to America for a better life as many of the earlier groups had. They weren't planning on sending money back to the old country to bring the rest of their family over. There was no more family. These immigrants were coming from a horrendous life. Their lives had been destroyed and they had been dehumanized. For many of them, all they knew was pain, suffering, and loss. They were part of a group that had been targeted for murder. These were survivors of genocide.
Once my father knew nobody else was coming back, the immigration process started again. And in January 1947, we took a train to Berlin and slept in a bombed out hotel, but all the buildings were bombed out in Budapest too, so that was nothing different. And next day we got on a Pan Am propeller plane and flew across the Atlantic. Now on this trip, my father told me all kinds of stories about this wonderful country we're going to. And since all my cousins in America were boys, I'd be the princess, because I was the only girl. And everybody in America was rich. People didn't wash clothes, they just threw it out and bought new. And I don't know if he truly believed in these stories or he just wanted his little girl to feel better. I have no idea.
When talking about the status of a Holocaust survivor's American dream, there are many things to take into account. Survivor is a very broad word. A survivor of the Holocaust is defined in many different ways, but the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum defines a Holocaust survivor as any persons, Jewish or non-Jewish, who were displaced, persecuted, or discriminated against due to the racial, religious, ethnic, social, and political policies of the Nazis and their collaborators between 1933 and 1945, including, among others, people who were refugees or were in hiding. It is also important to take into consideration the different ages, languages, genders, and individual experiences of each survivor. At first, the world was still in awe. Although new policies technically allowed the new immigrants to come into America, they still faced discrimination. Some survivors even claimed that when trying to find a job, it was difficult because some companies were still anti-Semitic. This eventually led to some survivors changing their names so they would sound more hireable. For many survivors who immigrated to a new country, especially one that speaks a different language, it can be extremely difficult to assimilate. A small number of survivors inevitably decided to leave. However, this ripped already broken families even farther apart.
Well, my father unfortunately didn't want to stay in the United States. He said he couldn't assimilate, he couldn't learn the language, he wanted to go back to Hungary. So he never actually came back to the apartment. I don't remember what hotel, but they took him to a hotel where I saw him, where I said goodbye to him. And it's really the last time I ever saw my father. Must have been 14 by that time. And then the story also came out that he sold his business on the contingency that if he comes back within a year, he could have it back. So even before we left, he already contemplated the possibility of leaving me here and going back. And my uncle, God bless him, He said, if you insist on going back, I'll pay your way, but in no way will I pay for the child to go back there to this murdering country. And because of that, we got separated. I never saw my father again.
As a Holocaust survivor, finding financial stability is extremely difficult. When coming to America, if they ever got a job, they were typically low paying, low pension, and no benefits. Medicaid and Social Security alone cannot help one of the most economically unstable groups in America. 1 out of every 3 of the living 100,000 survivors is living at or below the poverty line. Luckily, there are many organizations such as the Blue Card, the Jewish Federation, the National Council for Jewish Women, and the New York Association for New Americans to help survivors. The purpose of these organizations was to give financial aid, support, assistance, information, guidance, employment, housing help, and aid in language acquisition. Their goal was to help the survivors become self-sufficient as soon as possible.
Okay, here I am, a high school graduate with no working skills and 3 kids to support, and what am I going to do now? And by now I am in touch with the Jewish Federation, and I'm telling them, and their vocational department took a hold of me, and they wanted to send me cut to college. I said I'd love to go to college, but I have 3 kids to support, and they need to eat, and they need a roof over their heads. And so I went to business college for a year, and they paid for all that, and they even paid for my car fare to go there.
While these agencies can be extremely beneficial, they typically have a resettlement period that only allows for them to spend so much time and money on each survivor. It is incorrect to say that it is impossible for Holocaust survivors to obtain the American dream. However, it is extremely difficult given their horrific past. While some survivors never fully reach their version of the American dream, many have achieved theirs. One example is Elie Wiesel, an extremely accomplished writer who is highly regarded for his books Night, Day, and Dawn. These books are considered to be the masterpieces of Holocaust literature. He also won the Nobel Peace Prize.
And there was night on the coffee table. My granddaughter was reading it for school. I had not started talking about Holocaust, anything yet. And I picked up the book, and of course, once I picked it up, I couldn't put it down. And that was really my first thing, that because my uncle and aunt, they said, they didn't want to talk about it. Nobody wanted to hear about it. That when her brother was in 8th grade, he said to me, I happened to be visiting, Grandma, we're studying the Holocaust, would you come to my school and speak about it? And nobody ever wanted me to talk about it. Everybody always said, forget it. So, how do you forget something so horrendous? It's impossible to forget. And first you have to face the past before you can go forward. Anyhow, I said, Jonathan, I have to sleep on it. I don't know if I'm able to do this. And instead of sleeping, I took out some index cards and I made notes all night long. And those kids received me so warmly. That was the beginning of me speaking about it.
When talking about the Holocaust, there was a stigma. Many survivors felt as though no one wanted to hear their stories, but most weren't even ready to talk about it. Until recently, it was a subject that made very many people very uncomfortable and made survivors feel extremely vulnerable. Agnes even claims that her first husband did not know she was a survivor. Her kids did not find out until they were much older. For Agnes, there was a very defining moment that made her evaluate her experiences. After reading Night, she had a new understanding for her own story. She and many other survivors felt that no one wanted to know. Now survivors are aware of the necessity of telling their stories. They tell it so history doesn't repeat itself and so we never forget what happened.
I just think that the world is going backwards now instead of forward. The European countries have become very anti-Semitic, and I see anti-Semitism rising in the United States too. And that's one of the reasons I speak. So the younger generation knows what happened, so we don't go backwards. And I often say that to the kids. It's not a pleasure to speak about it, but if we, the survivors, don't speak up, it will just go down as another page in a history book.
While the agencies stepped up to aid these newcomers, the type of help was not enough. They gave them the help they needed to become financially stable, but there was no significant effort to help them become mentally stable. They left out the human aspect of aiding survivors through difficult times. Not only is it difficult for survivors to move to a completely new country where they most likely don't know anyone and have little to no money, they are also more likely to develop mental illnesses. These mental illnesses include, but are not limited to, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. Often these feelings have been suppressed or hidden for years, and when they finally come out, the survivor feels weak. Surviving the Holocaust is hard, but surviving after the Holocaust can be even more difficult. A study published in the American Journal of Geriatric Psychiatry discusses how doctors at Tel Aviv University examined suicide rates of the elderly. In comparison to most elderly people, Holocaust survivors are 3 times more likely to commit suicide. It is also scientifically proven that descendants of Holocaust survivors are more of a risk for certain physical and mental diseases because of the trauma their ancestors have endured. Despite the fact that many survivors suffered from emotional distress, many remain resilient. They continue to do what they believe will benefit the next generations, even if it is difficult for them.
My uncle said to me when I was in the biggest trouble with that and how am I going to make a living, he said, well, darling, we'll help you find the right charity. And when he said that to me, I thought to myself, I'm not going to need charity. I'm going to make a living somehow, and I did. I never took a penny from anybody. The only thing is that the Federation sent me to school.
Many female survivors don't accredit their success in America to their career. For many of them, the weight of their success is based on the family they created. It is measured by the way their children are brought up and who they become. Their children's values, happiness, education, and Jewishness are what mattered most to mothers. Many felt so strongly that it was their duty to try and restore the world of family they knew before the war. For many female survivors, all they needed was the assurance that their children were born in America and would be promised to have a better childhood and life than they had.
I never had the American dream of rags to riches like so many people have, but my children were born in the land of the free, and that's more important to me, and my children have all done very well. And in spite of my tight situation, 2 of the 3 are college graduates.
As stated by Beth Cohen in her book Case Closed. If the only impressions we had of their reception were gleaned from contemporary media reports and Jewish organizations' accounts, or from the place of honor that survivors hold in our society today, we would be led to believe that America had welcomed survivors warmly and the refugees had acclimated without delay. It is a comforting thought from many perspectives, but unfortunately it is false. The experience of Holocaust survivors in America has generally been narrated as a victory. The mere ability to go on living has been viewed as ample proof of their triumph over Hitler. Such blanket statements veil important issues. As Case Closed shows, the post-war reality was exceedingly complicated. For many survivors, this era was imbued with vast and irrevocable loss. Through the focus on an external and uniformly happy ending, the complex and arduous period immediately after the Holocaust has been trivialized, minimized, and obscured. It has been reinvented into a story that is comforting but untrue.